All right, chapter 1. Since the age of 15, poetry has been my ruling passion, and I have never intentionally undertaken any task or formed any relationship that seems inconsistent with poetic principles, which has sometimes won me the reputation of an eccentric. Prose has been my livelihood, but I have used it as a means of sharpening my sense of altogether different nature of poetry, and the themes that I choose are always linked in my mind with outstanding poetic problems. At the age of 65, I am still amused at the paradox of poetry, obstinate continuance in the present phase of civilization. Though recognized as a learned profession, it is the only one for the study of which no academies are open and in which there is no yardstick, however crude, by which technical proficiency is considered measurable. Poets are born, not made. The deduction that one is expected to draw from this is that the nature of poetry is too mysterious to bear examination is indeed a greater mystery even than royalties, since kings can be made as well as born, and the quoted utterances of a dead king carry little weight either in the pulpit or the public bar. The paradox can be explained by the great official prestige that still somehow clings to the name of poet as it does to the name of king, and by the feeling that poetry, since it defies scientific analysis, must be rooted in some sort of magic, and that magic is disreputable. European poetic lore is indeed ultimately based on magical principles, the rudiments of which formed a close religious secret for centuries, but which were at last garbled, discredited, and forgotten. Now it is only by rare accidents of spiritual regression that poets make their lines magically potent in the ancient sense. Otherwise, the contemporary practice of poem writing recalls the medical of alchemists' fantastic and foredoomed experiments in transmuting base metal into gold. Except that the alchemist did at least recognize pure gold when he saw and handled it. The truth is that only gold ore can be turned into gold, only poetry into poems. This book is about the rediscovery of the lost rudiments and about the active principles of poetic magic that govern them. My argument will be based on a detailed examination of two extraordinary Welsh minstrel poems of the 13th century, in which the clues to this ancient secret are ingeniously concealed. By way of historical introduction, a clear distinction must first be drawn between the court bards and the wandering minstrels of ancient Wales. The Welsh bards, or master poets, like the Irish, had a professional tradition embodied in a corpus of poems which, literally memorized and carefully weighed, they passed on to the pupils who came to study under them. The English poets of today, whose language began as a despised late medieval vernacular when Welsh poetry was already a hoary institution, may envy them in retrospect. The young poet was spared the curse of having doubtfully to build up his poetic lore for himself by haphazardly reading, consultation with equally doubtful friends, and experimental writing. Latterly, however, it was only in Ireland that a master poet was expected or even permitted to write in an original style. When the Welsh poets were converted to Orthodox Christianity and subjected to a classical discipline, a process completed by the 10th century, as the contemporary Welsh laws show, their tradition gradually ossified. Though a high degree of technical skill was still required of master poets, and a chair of poetry was hotly contested in the various courts, they were pledged to avoid what the church called untruth, meaning the dangerous exercise of poetic imagination in myth or allegory. Only certain epithets and metaphors were authorized. Themes were similarly restricted, meters fixed, and Singahened, the repetitive use of consonantal sequences with variation of vowels became a burdensome obsession. The master poets had become court officials, their first obligation being to praise God, their second to praise the king or prince who had provided a chair for them at his royal table. Even after the fall of the Welsh princes in the late 13th century, this barren poetic code was maintained by the family bards in noble houses. T. Gwyn Jones writes in the Transactions of the Honourable Society of Cymrodorion, 1913 and 1914. The few indications which may be gathered from the works of the bards down to the fall of the Welsh princes imply that the system detailed in the laws was preserved, but probably with progressive modification. The Lifer Coch Hergest metrical code shows a still further development, which in the 15th century resulted in the Carmarthen Eisteddfod. The subject tradition recorded in this code, practically restricting the bards to the writing of eulogies and elegies and excluding the narrative, is proved to have been observed by the Goggenford court bards. Their adherence to what they conceived to be historical truth was probably due to the early capture of their organization by ecclesiastics. There was practically no use of the traditional material contained in the popular romances, and their knowledge of the names of mythical and quasi-historical characters was principally derived from the triads. Nature poetry and love poetry are only incidental in their works, and they show practically no development during the period. References to nature in the poems of the court bards are brief and casual and mostly limited to its more rugged aspects: the conflict of sea and strand, the violence of winter storms, the burning of spring growths on the mountains. The characters of their heroes are only indicated in epithets. No incident is completely described. Battles are dismissed in a line or two at most. Their theory of poetry, particularly in the eulogy, seems to have been that it should consist of epithets and allusions, resuming the bare facts of history, presumably known to their hearers. They never tell a story. They rarely even give anything approaching a coherent description of a single episode. Such indeed has been the character of most Welsh verse outside the popular ballads practically down to the present day. The tales of romances, on the other hand, are full of color and incident. Even characterization is not absent from them. In them, fancy, not affected by restrictions applying both to subject and form, develops into imagination. These tales were told by a guild of Welsh minstrels whose status was not regularized by the laws, who counted no bishops or ministers of state among their associates, and who were at liberty to use whatever diction, themes, and meters they pleased. Very little is known about their organization or history, but since they were popularly credited with divinatory and prophetic gifts and power of injurious satire, it is likely that they were descended from the original Welsh master poets who either refused or were refused court patronage after the chimeric conquest of Wales. The Cymry, whom we think of as the real Welsh and from whom the proud court bards were recruited, were a tribal aristocracy of Brythonic origin, holding down a serf class that was a mixture of Goidels, Brythons, Bronze Age and New Stone Age peoples, and Aboriginals. They had invaded Wales from the north of England in the 5th century A.D. The non-chimeric minstrels went from village to village or farmhouse to farmhouse, entertaining under the trees or in the chimney corner according to the season. It was they who kept alive an astonishingly ancient literary tradition, mainly in the form of popular tales, which preserved fragments not only of pre-chimeric but of pre-Godelic myth, some of which goes back as far as the Stone Age. Their poetic principles are summed up in a triad in the Lifer Coch Hergest, the Red Book of Hergest. 3 things that enrich the poet: myths, poetic power, a store of ancient verse. The 2 poetic schools did not at first come in contact. The big-bellied, well-dressed court bards being forbidden to compose in the minstrel style and penalized if they visited any but the houses of princes and nobles, the lean and ragged minstrels not being privileged to perform at any court, nor trained to use the complicated verse forms required of the court bards. However, in the 13th century, the minstrels were taken up by the Norman French invaders, apparently through the influences of Breton knights who could understand Welsh and who recognized some of the tales as better versions of those which they had heard at home. The Trouvères, or finders, translated them into contemporary French and adapted them to the Provencal code of chivalry, and in their new dress they conquered Europe. Welsh and Norman families now intermarried, and it was no longer easy to keep the minstrel out of the courts. In an early 13th century poem, one Philip Brided records a contention between himself and certain vulgar rhymesters as to who should first present a song on Christmas Day to his patron, Prince Rhys Eunuch at Llanbadarn Fawr in South Wales. Prince Rhys was a close ally of the Normans. The two 13th century poems which will be here examined are the work of a vulgar rhymester, vulgar at least by Philip's aristocratic canon of what a poet should be. They are called the Cad Godu and the Hans Taliesin. By the 14th century, the literary influence of the minstrels began to show even in court poetry, and according to 14th century versions of the bardic statute, Triod Curd the Pridid, or court bard, might write love poems, though debarred from satires, lampoon, charms, divination, or lays of magic. It was not until the 15th century that the poet David ap Gwilym won approval for a new form, the Quied, in which court poetry and minstrel poetry are united. For the most part, the court poets would not modify their obsolescent practice, remaining scornful and jealous of the favors shown to tellers of untruth. Their position declined with that of their patrons, and their authority finally collapsed as a result of the civil wars, in which Wales favored the losing side. Shortly before the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland also broke the power of the Olafs, master poets there. Yikes. It's all right, though. I knew I wouldn't know these words, and it's probably just going to get worse, so I don't really care. Its revival in the bardic Gorsid of the national Estafad is somewhat of a mock antique colored by early 19th century misconceptions of Druidic practice, yet the Estafad has served to keep alive a public sense of the honor due to poets, and contests for the bardic chair are as keen as ever. English poetry has had only a short experience of similar bardic discipline. The classicism of the 18th century, when highly stylized diction and meter and decorum of theme were insisted upon by admirers and imitators of Alexander Pope. A violent reaction followed, the Romantic Revival, then another partial return to discipline, Victorian classicism. Then a still more violent reaction, the modernistic anarchy of the 1920s and 1930s. English poets now appear to be considering a voluntary return to discipline, not to the 18th century straitjacket, nor to the Victorian frock coat, but to that logic of poetic thought which gives a poem strength and grace. But where can they study meter, diction, and theme? Where can they find any poetic government to which they may yield a willing loyalty? Meter, they would all probably agree, is the norm to which a poet relates his personal rhythm, the original copybook, copperplate, from which he gradually develops a unique personal handwriting. Unless such a norm is assumed, his rhythmic idiosyncrasies are meaningless. They would also probably agree about diction, that it should be neither over-stylized nor vulgar. But what of theme? Who has ever been able to explain what theme is poetic and what is unpoetic except by the effect that it has on the reader? The rediscovery of the lost rudiments of poetry may help to solve the question of theme. If they still have validity, they confirm the intuition of the Welsh poet Alan Lewis, who wrote just before his death in Burma in March 1944 of the single poetic theme of life and death, the question of what survives of the beloved. Granted that there are many themes for the journalist of verse, yet for the poet, as Alan Lewis understood the word, there is no choice. The elements of the single, infinitely variable theme are to be found in certain ancient poetic myths which, though manipulated to conform with each epoch of religious change, I use the word myth in its strict sense of verbal iconograph, without the derogatory sense of absurd fiction that it has acquired, yet remain constant in general outline. Perfect faithfulness to the theme affects the reader of a poem with a strange feeling between delight and horror, of which the purely physical effect is that the hair literally stands on end. A.E. Huysman's test of a true poem was simple and practical. Does it make the hairs on one's chin bristle if one repeats it silently while shaving? But he did not explain why the hairs should bristle. The ancient Celts carefully distinguished the poet, who was originally a priest and judge, as well as whose person was sacrosanct, from the mere gleeman. He was in Irish called filly or seer, in Welsh derwyd or oak seer, which is the probable derivation of druid. Even kings came under his moral tutelage. When two armies engaged in battle, the poets of both sides would withdraw together to a hill and there judiciously discuss the fighting. In the 6th century Welsh poem, the Gododdin, it is remarked that the poets of the world assessed the men of valor, and the combatants, whom they often parted by sudden intervention, would afterwards accept their version of the fight, if worth commemorating in a poem with reverence as well as pleasure. The gleeman, on the other hand, was a joculator or entertainer, not a priest, a mere client of the military oligarchs and without the poet's arduous professional training. He would often make a variety turn of his performance with mime and tumbling. In Wales he was styled as ercaid or suppliant, one who does not belong to an endowed profession, but is dependent for his living on the occasional generosity of chieftains. As early as the 1st century BC, we hear from Poseidonius, the Stoic, of a bag of gold flung to the Celtic gleeman in Gaul, and this at a time when the Druidic system was at its strongest there. If the gleeman's flattery of his patrons were handsome enough and his song sweetly enough attuned to their mead-sodden minds, they would load him with gold torques and honey cakes. If not, they would pelt him with beef bones. But let a man offer the least indignity to an Irish poet, even centuries after he had fortified his priestly functions, to the Christian cleric, and he would compose a satire on his assailant which would bring out black blotches on his face and turn his bowels to water, or throw a madman's wisp in his face and drive him insane. And surviving examples of the cursing poems of the Welsh minstrels show that they were also to be reckoned with. The court poets of Wales, on the other hand, were forbidden to use curses or satires and had to depend on legal redress for any insult to their indignity. According to the 10th century digest of laws affecting the Welsh household bard, they could demand an eric of 9 cows or 90 pence of money besides. The figure 9 recalls the ninefold muse, their former patroness. In ancient Ireland, the Olave or master poet sat next to the king at table and was privileged as none else but the queen was to wear 6 different colors in his clothes. The word bard, which in medieval Wales stood for a master poet, had a different sense in Ireland, where it meant an inferior poet who had not passed through the 7 degrees of wisdom, which made him an olave after a very difficult 12-year course. The position of the Irish bard is defined in the 7th century sequel to the Crith Gablach law. A bard is one without lawful learning but his own intellect. But in the later Book of Olaves, bound up in the 14th century Book of Ballymote, it is made clear that to have got as far as the 7th year of his poetic education entitled a student to the failed B.A. dignity of bardism. He had memorized only half the prescribed tales and poems, had not studied advanced prosody and metrical composition, and was deficient in knowledge of old Godelic. However, the 7 years course that he had taken was a great deal more severe than that insisted upon in the poetic schools of Wales, where the bards had a proportionately lower status. According to the Welsh laws, the Pencard or chief bard was only the 10th dignitary at court and sat on the left of the heir apparent, being reckoned equal in honor with the chief smith. Hold on. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. Remember, got to find my cadence. Got to figure all this out. And like I said, it took me 60 pages before I realized that I was like, man, this is getting really good. So you can either hang in there or don't. You know, you do whatever you want. But I had to get a reading in today of this because that introduction about Socratic sodomy, well, that was just interesting.